Good morning, Steven. I'd love to get into an apology about why it's been so long since I made a video, but this video is going to be long enough as it is, so let's just get right into it. As you know, Trish and I went to Italy 5 months ago, and this is a little delayed and it's not going to be terribly interesting, but I wanted to give you at least a little idea of our trip. Day 1, we flew into the Leonardo da Vinci airport, took a bus into the city, dropped our bags off at the hotel, and then headed out. Prior to leaving for this trip, we were told not to worry, everyone over there speaks English, and credit cards are accepted absolutely everywhere. Literally the first place we went into was a little shop to get some coffee, and no English, cash only. Great start. We were a bit jet lagged, so our day didn't last terribly long. We went to the National Museum of Rome, the Diocletian Baths, the Capuchin Crypts, and the Borghese Gallery, which is what you're looking at right now. We then headed back to the hotel to get some much needed rest and to hopefully start the next day just a little bit more refreshed. Day 2 was another day of visiting the sites of Rome, essentially at our own pace. The day began with us first figuring out the public transportation in the city. Everything we read about Rome said to avoid the subway, which left us to figure out the bus system. Turned out not to really be that bad. We made our first stop, the Castle of St. Angelo, with time to spare and without any issue at all. In terms of geographical location, this castle was kind of in the direction of the Vatican, so when you got to the top, there was a good view of St. Peter's, as you can see here. So it's now mid-morning. We bussed and then walked over to the Capitoline Hill Museums, where we got to look at marble statues and get a view of the Roman Forum from above. And then that afternoon, we had plans to go to the Appian Way, an ancient road south of the city with some sights to see along the way. When planning the trip, this was one of the hardest locations to figure out in terms of transportation. We took a bus to get there, which was no big deal, but then according to Rick Steve's Guide to Italy, we could then easily walk from there over to see the ancient aqueduct park. That walk turned out to be about an hour long, which wouldn't have been so bad if it didn't consist of shuffling along the shoulders of busy country highways and then traversing sketchy abandoned fields and graffiti-covered tunnels. Probably not the safest thing we did in retrospect. I definitely would not recommend doing it again. Well, we had to do the touristy stuff at some point. Day 3, as you can see, began with us touring the Colosseum and the Roman Forum. With people waiting in line everywhere, we luckily had tickets for a small tour group. It was only us and 3 other girls, actually all from Oklahoma. What are the odds? Our guide began by taking us on a walk through the Roman Forum, then up to some orange groves that overlook everything. When planning this trip, this day was one that we were actually most worried about because a week before we left, we realized that this day, April 25th, is Liberation Day in Italy, which from what I could gather online is a kind of 4th of July holiday where everyone is off work and the city is a madhouse. In the morning, the only evidence we saw of a holiday was this protest march, to which our tour guide said, "I wonder why they're protesting today," for which I then reminded her that today was a national holiday, but this kind of made it seem like we had worried about nothing. Anyway, we then headed over to use our skip the line tickets for the inside tour of the Colosseum. One weird thing about the Colosseum is that it's almost exactly like you picture it prior to getting there. It's been portrayed in movies so much that you would think, like with most other historical places, that you would say, oh my gosh, it's so much more blank in real life, but no, the movie's got it right. It was pretty much exactly like you picture it being. I thought it was still cool, but Trish was underwhelmed. That afternoon was spent just walking around to see the local sights. First stop was Altar of the Fatherland, or maliciously called the Wedding Cake by locals who dislike its showiness. We did get to take an elevator to the top for a sky view of Rome, which was cool. The theme by far of the afternoon was crowds, crowds, crowds. Everywhere we went, we found droves of people. Kind of made the experience less enjoyable as we walked to the Pantheon, the Spanish Steps, and the Trevi Fountain, but we just went with it, and we at least got to see everything we wanted to see. End of day 3. Our last day in Rome, day 4, in keeping in our trend of doing touristy things, we had a booked tour of the Vatican. So everywhere online says the Vatican is busy, like busy to the point that it severely detracts from the experience. We did a group tour, so that's the only tour option I can actually comment on here. The Vatican has so many cool historical things to look at, but when you're touring as a group, you spend 90% of the time just trying to make sure that you don't get separated from your guide who is moving at a breakneck pace through the buildings. We did get a solid 20 minutes to spend in the Sistine Chapel, which is supposed to be like a silent, religious, picture-free experience, but actually ends up being a super crowded room in which a guy comes on a booming microphone every 30 seconds or so and shushes the room, ironically calling for silencio. St. Peter's Basilica was gorgeous, though. It wasn't quite so rushed, but boy, was it just as crowded. In retrospect, I don't know what would be a better option because the massive crowds would exist regardless. I think, though, a private tour would probably be of benefit because at least then you'd be able to move at a slower pace, perhaps getting to savor more. We dealt with a brief downpour following the Vatican tour, but from there we simply grabbed lunch and then returned to our hotel. That night, we had a food tour of the Trastevere neighborhood. Trish and I agreed that this was absolutely the best thing we did while we were in Rome. The tour was very well planned, so you got to see and hear about a bunch of cool things, but you also got to sample amazing food all over the neighborhood. Stops included an ancient wine cellar, a meat shop, a couple of restaurants, and of course, it finished with gelato. A perfect end to our time in Rome. So day 5, we checked out of our hotel and boarded a train to Naples, and from there we took a shuttle to Pompeii, which turned out to not be so much of a shuttle as a questionably sketchy subway. But we made it, and for the record, taking a train across the Italian countryside is just as incredible as it sounds. While in Pompeii, we had 2 things on the checklist, the ancient ruins and Mount Vesuvius, so we decided to do Vesuvius first. To get to the top of the mountain, you first have to take a city bus from the train station and then transition to a smaller bus for the rest of the way. So we did not take something into account. Down in the city of Pompeii, the weather was beautiful, sunny, and around 70 degrees. The bus dropped us off, and already at this altitude, the temperature was solidly in the upper 30s. So here's the 2 of us freezing our asses off as we hike up the path as everyone else looks at us in pity. We were getting pelted by frozen rain by the time we actually reached the top, and the temperature was now well below freezing. We lasted just long enough up there for me to get an espresso from the coffee shop at the top of the mountain, because of course we're in Italy and they have coffee shops on top of their mountains, even though it was technically in a tent and technically the coffee was served in paper cups, but a coffee shop is a coffee shop. We took the bus back down and thawed out in our hotel as we prepared for the next day. Now it's day 6, and we just have one final thing to do in Pompeii, and that was visit the ruins. The ruins are incredible because in parts of it you see devastation, but in other parts where plants have been regrown, you feel like you're in the ancient city before tragedy struck. And of course, at all times, the ominous Vesuvius looms and can be seen from anywhere in the ruins. So that was it for Pompeii. Onto the sketchy subway shuttle again, this time to Sorrento. In Sorrento, we had a supposedly short walk down to the pier that wasn't really so much a short walk because it involved carrying our luggage down lots and lots and lots of stairs. From the pier, we boarded a ferry to the island of Capri, and we both agree that Capri was absolutely the highlight of our trip. I'm not a big beach person, but apparently I am a big island person. We took a bus up into the city, dropped our bags off at the hotel, and took a quick stroll over to the Augustus Gardens. The gardens were fine, but they were set at the edge of a cliff, and the view that they provided from here was absolutely breathtaking. We ate dinner that night at a tiny restaurant that gave us this very same view, and that was easily the best meal of the entire trip. We started day 7 with a hurried downhill walk to the pier from our hotel. We stopped for brief sandal shopping before getting on a boat that was to give us a tour around the island. The tour was fine, but the water was pretty choppy, so we both started to get a little sick by the end. The last stop on the tour was the Blue Grotto, which you get into small rafts and are then taken into this cool cave where the light reflects off the walls in such a way that makes it, well, blue. While you're in there, the rafters also start singing in Italian, which just kind of adds to the effect. After this tour, we visited the ancient Phoenician steps. These would supposedly serve as a historic site to see, but also would be a path to our next stop on the island. We didn't factor in, however, the sheer feat that climbing these steps would be. It took a solid hour to get to the top and sapped us of pretty much all energy that we had. Luckily, the next to-do on the list was a sit-down one. We rode a chairlift to the highest point on the island, Monte Solaro. We were short on time by this point, so we spent about 3 minutes at the top enjoying the view before heading back down, grabbing a bus to our hotel, and then running our bags down the island to the pier to catch a ferry. This ferry took us to Naples, where we caught a train to Rome, and from there boarded a train to Venice with just minutes to spare. We made it to Venice quite late that night. Day 8, and our last full day in Italy, was spent in the beautiful city of Venice. If Venice and Capri have one thing in common, it is that they are relatively calm in the morning and then absolute madhouses in the afternoon after the cruises arrive and bring all the tourists. We spent our day in Venice seeing the sights. We saw the Doge's Palace in the morning, which offered beautiful things to look at, and then stopped next door at St. Mark's Basilica, which is pretty much entirely gold mosaic on the inside, but unfortunately, no cameras were allowed. We then waded through crowds around the city as we waited for our afternoon walking tour to begin. By the time we got to it, a walking tour of the city was a bit overkill, but we participated regardless. During the tour, the guide, when talking about La Fenice, the famous Venetian opera house, referred to its English translation as Phoenix instead of Phoenix, to which an American tour participant corrected and said, "I can't understand you because Phoenix is spelled with a PH, not an F." Made me proud to be an American at that moment. Our tour concluded with a gondola ride because, of course, you can't go to Venice and not ride a gondola. The views were amazing, but the waters in Venice have a particularly pungent smell, especially if you're in any part except for the main channel. Speaking of opera house, we finished the day by going to hear a soprano perform there that night. And that concluded our day in Venice, and thus concluded our Italy trip. Steven again, I apologize for the delay in getting this video up. I hope my next video will be a little bit more punctual when I upload it. And that video will probably be an update on my life versus a summary of a trip that I went on 6 months ago. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking over simply a black screen because it's kind of creepy and I don't like it. So for now, this is goodbye. Goodbye.